Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. Today we're going to talk about WTO, about the last ministerial conference a couple of weeks ago, and the future for the international trading system. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, and I have two fantastic guests with me today. I have Johanna Hill, who is the new Deputy Director General for WTO in Geneva, and she has a background as a trade negotiator, a trade consultant, and a trade minister. And we have Professor André Sapir joining us from Brussels, who is a professor at Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium, and also a senior fellow at Bruegel, a think tank in Brussels, and the author of a number of books about EU economy, trade, WTO, etc. So you're both very welcome. So on overtime, as usual, the 13th Ministerial Conference, this time in Abu Dhabi, ended on March 1st. This is something that comes on a regular basis. Every second year, trade ministers from WTO, all the members, they meet every second year to try to agree on ways forward in the WTO. It has been difficult the last years, and I think it's no exaggeration to say that WTO is in a crisis. It has been difficult to come to decision, and we do need reform. Reform was supposed to be the theme of the conference, but in this regard, very little happened. There is a lack of will and political engagement from the member states to adopt WTO to modern trade demands. Yet there is so much we would need to do to make the organization smoother, more flexible, addressing current challenges and growing protectionism, and also how to address the wave of subsidies sweeping all over the world, the growth of digital trade, and of course, how trade can become greener and fairer to handle the climate challenges and the necessary transition. WTO is still, though, the center for global trade, and 75% of all trade flows in the world goes under the rules of WTO. And most countries do recognize the value of strong international rules, but the will to engage in reform is, for different reasons, not really there. So how can we restore the multilateral system, and what is the way forward? So let's start by looking at MC13. There were a few deliverables there. There were a few successes, a few adoption, new members, and an agreement to prolong the moratorium on duties for e-commerce, for instance. But there was very little on, or if very little, if at anything at all, on reforms, nothing on agriculture, and the member states did not manage to solve the remaining issue of the locked dispute settlement system. Someone said that the best thing with MC13 was that it held the line against backsliding. And this is, of course, good, but is it good enough? So why don't we start with you, Johanna? You are the Deputy Director. I think you have recovered a little bit after these very hard working days and all the preparatory work, and you also played a very important role in trying to advance negotiations. What would be the greatest outcomes, in your view, from Abu Dhabi, and the biggest disappointments?
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss the outcomes of MC13 with you and Andre. The WTO Ministerial Conference is indeed quite a unique experience. It's like a race that goes on for several days and nights. The main difference being that in this kind of a race, there are different finish lines, and each one changes depending on the runners. So this is what makes it quite difficult to evaluate the results of a ministerial conference or lack thereof. It depends on which runner you were behind. So to understand this better, I think we first need to take into account the context in which the ministerial was taking place. And as you're very well aware, it was a very challenging one in terms of geopolitics and economic situation. And I think that weighed heavily. In the months leading up to the ministerial, there was uncertainty and instability prevalent around the globe, persistent inflationary pressures, looming economic slowdown, disruptions in vital trade routes, and conflicts from Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe. And also, I think, very important to remember the high prices for food energy, and other essentials have kept fueling political frustrations in some quarters, and we even saw farmer protests in some countries. So against this complex international backdrop, we also had, I have heard, nearly half of the world's population going to the ballot box this year. So looming elections in some 50 countries, I think, did make reaching agreements any easier, right? Especially in those decisions that might have had political implications at home. So even if the most recent discussions here in Geneva prior to the conference were constructive and were inspiring cautious optimism, I think that what really matters about MC13 is that progress was made in nearly all fronts, right? So as you said, the accession of 2 new member states, but also the entry into force on disciplines on services, domestic regulation. I think that was a very important advancement. And also even in agriculture and fisheries. In agriculture, for example, for the first time in a long time, members worked off a single text. And unlike previous ministerials, they didn't reject the text proposed by the facilitator. So I think this result was within the reasonable expectations for the delegations that were traveling to Abu Dhabi. Of course, many had higher hopes for the second wave of fisheries agreement negotiations. And I don't want to speculate on whether an agreement was within reach or not. As usual, the devil's in the details. But members did manage to narrow gaps significantly. But some issues just proved too difficult to find common ground in the time that ministers had available. But I do think that it's important to take into account not only the entry into force of these good regulatory practices for services that I mentioned, also the direct response to some of the needs and requests from the least developed countries and developing countries on issues such as LDC graduation, or making more effective special and differentiated treatment provisions on the SPS and TBT agreements. We also marked the finalization of the investment facilitation for development agreement and the commitment to reform the dispute settlement system by end of this year. And finally, as you mentioned, the extension of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. I think what was also an accomplishment at the ministerial is that ministers were able to engage in deliberations on how trade relates to sustainable development and how trade relates to socioeconomic inclusion. I think those are 2 very pressing issues that humanity is facing today, and trade definitely has an important role to play. I also think we should factor in another result when assessing the ministerial. It's that it was an opportunity for ministers to exchange views, confront each other, and discuss thorny issues. And I'm hoping that from this process, further guidance can be given to Geneva-based delegates so that we can work from here on forward. And what is most vital, I think, is that these advancements that I have mentioned are not rolled back once we get back from Abu Dhabi. So I think the discussions are important to continue in Geneva in the spirit of cooperation, and maybe away from the limelight of the ministerial meeting, members can continue to make progress. A lot of groundwork was done. And let me repeat some of the words that the Deputy Prime Minister of Fiji and how he described the process at Abu Dhabi in a very moving way. During the closing ceremony of NC13, he said, "We fought hard. We argued a lot, but in the end, we have become very close friends." And that is the beauty of the WTO.
Thank you for that, Johanna, and thanks for being a little bit optimistic. We need that today. André, what's your take on this, if you would give an overall summary of what was agreed and what wasn't?
Thanks, Cecilia. It's great to be here with you and Johanna. And let me start by saying that, you said, Cecilia, that holding the line against backsliding is good, but maybe not enough. And I do share basically that view, but I want to be optimistic. I think that given the geopolitical confrontation that we are living through, with many elements that Joanna just recalled, I think not backsliding is in and of itself not bad. I mean, we have to remember that the GATT, the WTO, are bodies or concepts that have behind them the view that most of us would espouse, which is that trade is a positive sum game. Now, in a world of geopolitical confrontation, there is a different logic that prevails, and that's a logic of zero-sum game. So there is no doubt a difficulty for a body like the WTO with its logic and its long embedded logic to deal with this world of confrontation. And so I regard the fact that I think, and as you said, Cecilia, I think the WTO rules are still central to the way countries organize their trade relations as something very, very important. So yes, certainly MC13 will not remain in the history of humanity as one of great progress. But I think, again, not having, holding the line against backsliding it should not be underestimated, underappreciated for its value. Now, this being said, and I share basically, again, Johanna's, element where she listed some of the progresses that have been made at MC13. I do have one disappointment, and that's with regard to, I think, the other big challenge of the day. One is geopolitics, but I think the other big challenge of the day, not just for trade, but for humanity in general, is the climate problem. So there, the fact that the ministerial declaration was not able to mention and trade and environment, trade and climate is more than a disappointment. I would say it's a worry, and it's a worry for trade and for climate, for both of them. Now, the climate objective, obviously, and the Paris Agreement, I think is paramount. And I don't think we can really, and I don't think everybody realizes it, but I don't think that we can really make a huge amount of progress on climate if we don't have the proper trade rules. So, trade and climate, they are not mutually exclusive. Quite on the contrary, they should reinforce one another. Now, I was hopeful on the ability of the WTO membership to seize the challenge of trade and climate. I was hopeful in 2023 when Dr. Ngozi, as Director General of the WTO, did go to the COP and engaged with participants. After all, it was the first time that trade was featured as a specific theme at a COP. Unfortunately, it's clear that so far the WTO membership has not fulfilled my hopes, and the absence of a decision at MC13 to add trade and the environment, and especially trade and climate, on the WTO's work program is obviously not good news, again, neither for climate nor for trade. If I had to look forward on this, I would certainly not give up on trade and climate as the way, not just for the trade community to come together, but again, the trade community looking at trade as a means towards an objective, which in principle is a shared objective by all UN members and by definition, therefore, by all WTO members. I do find that in a recent paper, Pascal Lamy and his co-authors, I do find that paper made a very, very useful contribution to thinking on how to deal with the matter by adding a third leg to the discussion or the discussion that I would hope would come on trade and climate, adding a third leg, which is development. And development did feature, as it always does, at MC13, and I think there was some progress that was done there. Obviously, a very complex issue, but I think in the context of trade and climate, adding this development leg to the issue is absolutely essential. So yes, if I were to look forward and on the WTO, despite the difficult environment of geopolitics, which I repeat is essentially a zero-sum attitude to problems, in order to be able to bring back the WTO towards this positive sum game, and the contribution of WTO, of trade to climate, I think would be really what is needed. So if I were at the helm of the WTO secretariat and trying to bring members to agreement with the perspective of MC14, I think I would put all of my efforts, and I know that the Director General is doing a lot in this area, but to convince members that indeed WTO rules are needed now more than ever, not just to get some small, although important, economic gains, but to get to advance on the most important issue of the day and of many years and decades to come, which is climate. So let me stop here for my initial remarks.
Well, that's an invitation to act, Johanna. But it is true. I mean, it's an urgent challenge that the whole world is facing, and it is a paradox that while the world really need cooperation for global common challenges, global institutions, WTO is not the only one, are weaker than in a very long time. And this is a very sad paradox. There were some initiatives on plastics and fossil fuels, and there is this development sustainability dialogue, I think, that is ongoing. But could WTO do more to sort of link trade and climate in the way that André and many others are calling for, Johanna? I know that, of course, you just recovered from the MC, and you also need members with you. But if you speculate a little bit.
Well, I agree with both of you that environment in general and climate change in particular is one of the most difficult challenges the world is facing today, and we all have a role to play. And I like that André recognized that the WTO had an important role to play at COP28, because trade and environment had a space for themselves, a pavilion. The International Chamber of Commerce, the International Trade Center, UNCTAD, and the WTO were present to discuss different ways that trade and environment could support each other. For example, trade in promoting green hydrogen and other initiatives. And also, as a secretariat, the WTO launched a trade policy toolkit for climate action. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but it serves as a source of information and inspiration to policymakers around the world. It covers 10 policy areas where governments have introduced measures that support the transition to a low-carbon economy, improve the flow of climate-friendly goods and services, decarbonize supply chains, and build resilience. So I think that on top of the work being done at the multilateral level, there is also, like you mentioned, the work being done at the plurilateral level in these structured discussions and initiatives. But also as a secretariat, we are doing our part, right? Research is also, I think, an important area that we are doing at the secretariat, on carbon pricing, for example. And our Director General has called for, as suggested for a coordinated task force with other international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, UNCTAD, because they're all working on carbon pricing research. So I think that there's a lot that we can also do to foster a shared understanding amongst these organizations on carbon pricing and equivalent climate policies, so that we can then share with our membership information on what is going on in these important areas that definitely have not only a trade aspect, but consequences in trade relations.
And they can also cause a lot of trade tensions because, as you mentioned, carbon pricing is now popping up in different versions all over the world. And you can, if you believe in climate change, most researchers will tell you that putting a price on carbon in whatever form is a very good way to address it. We have the EU CBAM now gradually entering into force, and I think we have 30 different jurisdictions of carbon pricing variants, and they all aim to do the same thing, but slightly differently. And we risk, if they're all put together, and you also want to sort of punish dirty trade, we risk to have serious trading conflicts between partners who actually want to achieve the same goals. And of course, ideally, WTO would play a role to mitigate it, to make sure that there's some sort of coordination there. Now, I realize it is hard to do this because you need to have the consent of the member states. But do you think that this could be something at the end of this process of gathering information and research and so on, Johanna, that you just mentioned?
Well, I can't speculate what members will in the end decide to do. But as I mentioned, the whole issue on sustainable development is a prevailing issue. I mean, we talk about it on the Committee on Trade and Environment, obviously. Ministers dedicated an afternoon to discussing sustainable development and inclusiveness. So in different areas, these issues are being addressed. At the end of the day, I'm not sure how members will, decide how they best want to contribute and tackle the challenges of the climate transition. But I think that we have a lot of work that's already been done, and hopefully we can build on that.
And André, you talked about what should be done at WTO, and I think we can agree. But how would you propose it to be done? To integrate climate much more in trade from a WTO perspective.
Sure. I mean, the technical work is needed, and but again, there needs to be some sense of urgency here. What I really worry is, and I think that the WTO and the WTO Secretariat has a role to play in instilling some sense of urgency, because almost every country now is adopting some form of carbon measure or the other. Whether it's about carbon pricing, whether it's about subsidy, you can name it, whether you can call it industrial policy. I mean, measures are just popping up everywhere. And I think many of those measures are actually good measures. So I'm not saying that because they are measures, and even some measures that do have, in a sense, negative impact on trade flows, they're not necessarily bad measures. It's not because they have negative impact on trade flows that they are bad. What is bad is measures that, in a sense, are not in the spirit of achieving the objective of the climate transition, and not in the spirit of WTO rules. So this is where we need to go, right? But whether that means in some instances that there will be less trade, well, so be it. There is less trade. Less trade doesn't mean more discrimination on trade. Okay, so maybe we have had in some occasions, because we are not properly having a proper carbon pricing, maybe there is sometimes too much trade. So, it can very well be that taking more seriously climate will reduce trade in certain instances. So no problem on my part on that. So what I'm trying to is to minimize indeed the number one, the friction between countries, because no doubt there is also greenwashing as far as trade measures are concerned. Trade measures are sometimes labeled to aim at climate issue, while in fact they are purely protectionist. So that's what I call the greenwashing. It's protectionism disguised in climate problems. That is definitely not acceptable, and that should be negotiated upon. But it should not be negotiated that we don't take measures that may have, even a negative impact on trade. Technical work is needed, yes, not just about carbon pricing, about carbon content. I mean, you spoke, Cecilia, about the CBAM. I'm on record saying that CBAM is a positive development. And I do believe that CBAM, if challenged, would be found to be challenged at the WTO, would be found to be compatible with WTO rules. Nonetheless, it may very well be the case that some of the specifics of the CBAM application are problematic. And that's where I think the work needs to be done. It's not about the principle of CBAM. Yes, we are doing domestic pricing in Europe about carbon, and that has external implication. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. Is the way that the CBAM regulation is put into motion not creating any problem, not discriminatory? I think that needs to be seen, and we shall see, and we will have to see how other countries are doing that. So that needs to be discussed very, very much, all of those countries. And that's the same thing about subsidies. Yes, many of the subsidies that are rolled out for the purpose of fighting climate change, I think are excellent. And no economist could say that, subsidies are bad in the area of climate. Does it mean that all subsidies and all the bells and whistles attached to those subsidies are good? The answer is no. So I think it's not very complicated, really, at this stage. That doesn't take another 2 years to list all of the issues that are there, that countries are applying around the world. And all countries, again, I repeat, are committed to the Paris Agreement. All countries are applying climate measures. Let's make the list of all of those measures, and let's agree on where there's absolutely no problem, where there are difficulties, and let's then try to focus where the negotiation need to be about. But we can't wait another 2 years for MC14 to come and agree on that. This is just not good enough vis-a-vis the climate objective.
But the work can certainly go on between the MC13 and what you said, Johanna, about the mapping and the research. And I think, but please tell me more about this. I think there is a project between WTO, World Bank, IMF, and OECD for a joint mapping of subsidies all over the world, not only in the climate area, but also in other fields. And what we do see today is an avalanche of subsidies in the world, and there is a WTO network framework at the bottom of this. Surely it needs to be revised and updated, because subsidies can be useful, but there are good subsidies and bad subsidies, and I think the term is do no harm. So we must make sure that my subsidy doesn't hurt you. And this, of course, was very much touched upon when you negotiated the fisheries agreement, where countries are now starting to sign up, but there's still a lot of countries missing before it can enter into force. But there is a lot of work going on subsidies outside the sort of big MC events, right, Johanna?
Yes, and I think this brings me to an important point that I think it's always important to remind ourselves. The negotiating function of this institution is incredibly important, as well as the role in dispute settlement. But also the role of implementation of current agreements is also super important. Issues regarding notifications, transparency, having forums where there can be information be brought to bear, discussions can be undertaken, be it on subsidies, being on issues regarding climate change. It's important to have an organization where members can access information. And this is really important for the developing world, smaller economies, to have a central platform where they can gather information of what's happening and then analyze how that might affect their trading relations and then their economy in general. And sometimes we forget to mention and value that important role that the WTO has. And obviously that is very much present in the area of subsidies, the current disciplines that we have, and also in newer ones in the case of fisheries that you mentioned.
If I can add one element,
please, André,
if I can add one element on this as a suggestion, and it may sound a little wacky, but I think it would be very useful, is to involve not just trade ministers, the trade community, those who met at the ministerial conference, but to try to find a way to reach out to the finance minister community. And the reason why I'm saying that is about the subsidy. Subsidy is getting to be, and again, you said, and we agree on this, Cecilia, there are good and bad subsidies. But subsidies, even the good subsidies, they're costly. All of our countries are facing some limits on their public debt, and no others than the finance ministers are very, very much aware of this. And I do recall an earlier period when we were facing a lot of problem of subsidies in agriculture, and which was not only a trade problem, but became at some stage a finance problem, a problem of public resources. And finance ministers did participate, at least on the sideline, on this discussion, because they were very much putting pressure on governments, including on their trade ministers, on their prime ministers, that we needed to come to an agreement at the WTO in order to limit subsidies. Again, not only from the unfair competition side of it, but from the cost to the public purse. And I think here, at some stage, I think finance ministers are going to wake up in countries and realize that those programs, they are needed, but they are very, very costly. And to try to eliminate part of it, the bad subsidies, and concentrate on the good subsidy, is something that will appeal, I'm sure, to finance ministers. And so some kind of an alliance between trade ministers from one perspective and finance minister from a different perspective, I think it's very useful. Again, we have a director general at the WTO who has a background into this. And I think it's very, very useful. And I think full use should be made of that.
Maybe Dr. Ngozi can invite her former colleagues, finance ministers, for a ministerial, and to see if they can bring some order into the subsidies discussions. Is this something that has been discussed?
Definitely, the close relationship we have with the World Bank and the IMF allows us for that sharing of information and mapping of what is happening. But it's also a vehicle for communication, formal communication with finance ministers, obviously. And the Director General is obviously very active in her communications with those institutions and the finance ministers. I think one of the greatest strengths of the Director General is her ability to speak, right? To speak directly, to speak clearly on what issues are, confronting humanity and the role that trade has to improve lives, or and how we could minimize those unintended consequences or spillovers, especially in the developing world. I think is something that we're all very concerned about. And so, yes, we have formal initiatives with these institutions on the issue of mapping the subsidies, but we also have a Director General that has a very close relationship with finance ministers, and having been a finance minister can obviously understand where they're coming from.
Obviously. one additional element, and you mentioned it briefly, Johanna, that there was an agreement to try to find a way forward on the dispute settlement mechanism before the end of the year. Now we know that this is a very tricky issue, and with certain elections in mind, it might not be very realistic that this will find a solution before the end of the year. Even how much you try at the WTO, there are coming a few questions from our audience on the dispute settlement mechanism, because if you have rules, and you said it yourself, they need to be enforced, and if you don't have an enforcement mechanism, and that goes for subsidies and for climate issue and what have you, this of course needs to be addressed. So what could be a credible way forward? There are a few countries initiated by the EU, and I think the 25 member countries member of a sort of parallel dispute settlement mechanism of an appellate body, and that works. Should that be made more like a permanent plurilateral initiative while waiting, and then see whoever wants to join can join, because China is in, and all the EU countries, Japan, Australia, so big clients of the system are in there, or should you start totally afresh? I know that there are lots of paper being published and produced on this, but how do you see the way forward towards the end of the year, Johanna, and then Andrea, because you have written about this as well?
I think that, well, the ministerial decision that was taken at MC13 obviously recalls the MC12 commitment to have a fully well-functioning dispute settlement system by the end of the year. And I think it's important that at MC13 we recall and the progress and the work that has been done so far, because a lot of work has been done. And it continues to welcome submissions from all members. So it's very important that all members have a chance to voice their needs and their concerns in this process. And it instructs officials to accelerate the discussions and to do it in an inclusive and a transparent manner, building on the progress that's already been made, and to look at unresolved issues like the one you mentioned, obviously, on the appeals and review, and also the accessibility of countries to the system. So I think that this decision represents a fine and delicate balance, meeting the expectations of all the members and paving, a path forward for future work. And most importantly, it reaffirms their strong resolve to achieve this by the end of the year. So I think that it's important, and in the one sense, as I said, it recognizes the work done so far, and to build upon it, expecting something by the end of the year.
André, what's your take on this?
This is really a very tough one, obviously, and elections have been mentioned. So the whole context is very, very complicated. I would say the context is partly about the geopolitics, and in a sense also about national security. So, I mean, if you look at the GATT period, so I think we should look at 3 periods, sort of the GATT period, the early years of the WTO, and where we are now. So during the GATT period, the world was divided into 2 political spheres. One sphere was us, quote unquote. We were members of the GATT. And then there was the other sphere, Soviet Union, China, that was not in the GATT. So we had a political divide, but the world was not unified economically, right? So between those 2 spheres, there was basically no trade, and national security was not a problem, right? There were very few countries that ever used national security as ground for their action, and even fewer instances of dispute, even in the old system, the GATT system, about national security. Then came the second period, the early years of the WTO, the end of history, no geopolitical problem. Everything was about economics, about global value chains, right? About unifying the world, a flat world. And during that period, everything was rosy. There was no geopolitics. We did not have two spheres anymore, but we had one sphere. WTO was really the World Trade Organization. Every country became a member, and everything was hunky-dory. And then the system went into difficulty, and geopolitics came back with a vengeance. And so now we have a world where all the countries are members of the WTO, but we are again going into two spheres, two political spheres, while at the same time markets are unified, although slowly but surely probably fragmenting. And so that situation, and with national security becoming again much more prevalent than it had ever been, is quite an issue. So I do have personally a difficulty in understanding how we can get to the bottom, not the surface, but to the bottom of the dispute settlement, and in particular the appellate body matter, which I think is very, very important. No doubt, and I would like to see it reinstated, the two-level system. But I have a hard time to see how this can be done without some kind of a view on the part of the membership about national security, about geopolitics, and about how much geopolitics to bring into the WTO, about how much not to bring it into the WTO. But that needs to be dealt with, and I think it's even much more when we speak about appellate body, it sounds like a very technical issue. What are the different solutions, and all the lawyers can give us. But I don't think that this is really what the matter is about. The matter is about something much more difficult and much deeper, which is the way the world is evolving, about the importance of geopolitics and increasing geopolitical conflicts, if not military conflicts altogether. And so this is, where's the border between that and the WTO? Once we deal with that, then I think we can ask people to solve the problem of the appellate body. I think that's quite an easy one. But it's really a deep down political problem. Where are we going? Are we willing to take are countries willing to not use national security, or not bring national security into the dispute settlement? How do we deal with that? So I think that's what really needs to be tackled. Sort of the political problem. The legal problem can be fixed, I think, easily.
Well, that's a tricky question, because as you say, countries are using the national security exception to legitimize all kinds of protectionist matters, and they're very much geopolitical right now, and will probably be so for quite some time. So it would be difficult maybe for the WTO to deal with this, but somehow it has to be spoken about. Johanna, do you have any comment to this easy question? Once that is fixed, you can do the dispute settlement. You're muted.
Yes, I was muted. Well, yes, definitely. We recognize all of the difficulties that this process has, but I think that what is interesting is a little bit of in this process that has been undertaken under the leadership of former Deputy Permanent Representative Marco Molina, is trying to get members in the discussions to focus a little bit more not on their positions or text yet, but more on their interests and concerns, right? And try to capture that before getting down to the nitty-gritty of textual deliberations. And it seems like many members have been happy with the progress made so far in that sense, because they have been able to understand each other and come to some understandings of positions and where the considerations are. I can't predict, the final outcome of this work, but I do think it's important to be open to new ways of discussing things and analyzing issues.
Well, it's certainly always better to talk, and sometimes in the big political debate, there's one one view of the world, but when delegates sit around a table, even if they don't agree, talking together is useful. But one additional problem with this is, of course, and there are many questions related to this core, and one of our viewers is calling it the tyranny of consensus. So the way to move forward with agreement, with more plurilateral agreements that are open for countries to join, but not everybody has to join, at least not from the beginning. Is this something that should be the way forward to break deadlocks and to see how you could work with this, or should it even be put into some sort of statutes that you would be moving from consensus? Because now there are 2 more members, 166 members, 10 or 12 queuing up, with 180, 200 members with so many different systems and all the national security element coming into it. It will be impossible to agree with everybody on all these tricky issues. Or how do you see this? You have been writing a little bit about this as well, André.
Yes,
About
very much so.
plurilateral agreements.
Yes, very much so. So I'm a bit of 2 minds about plurilaterals. On the one hand, yes, I do think that they are very useful. As you said, we have 166 WTO members now, with the huge amount of diversity, heterogeneity amongst them. So perfectly understandable, obviously, that it's very, very hard to make progress on every single issue with consensus of the entire body. So yes, I do think that plurilaterals can help, and I thought that what happened at MC13, some progress in this direction on 2 specific issues: the domestic services regulation and the investment facilitation agreement. Yes, I think they're useful, and they give dynamism into the system, and it keeps the system advancing. So sure, we can't do it with everyone. Let's do it with a smaller group, but provided obviously that a number of conditions are being respected. So yes, I think that is useful, and I very much encourage that. On the other hand, I think there is another hand. I think that to believe that plurilaterals can be used to deal with the big problems, like appellate body matters, like trade and climate, industrial policy, those kind of issues, there I don't believe that agriculture even, I don't believe that plurilaterals are the solution. So where the problems are very, very complicated, I think they need to be dealt with at the very, very minimum among some of the key countries. So that some other countries may not want to join, that would be fine. But I don't think there is any way around, and I don't need to list the countries that are the key countries. But I don't think that plurilaterals that would not have all of the key countries for the key issues is useful at all, or can be dreamt as the solution. So it's a solution, but to smaller issues, not to the very key issues.
What's your view on this, Johanna? Eventually, some countries would get tired of never getting results and do agreements on their own.
Well, I think that the strength of the world trading system is its multilateralism, right? It's based on multilateralism, and that comes with a lot of benefits, but of course it has its drawbacks, and it makes for difficult to come to understandings, especially as the membership gets more diverse and bigger. But that's the beauty at the same time of the WTO. That's its strength, right? And yes, the WTO is made in such a way that it allows for plurilaterals. There is a process, right? for plurilaterals that at the end requires it to be brought into the multilateral trading system, that it be open to any member to join and not harm anyone. So I think that those initiatives are open and they are being pursued. And I think what's important now is to find common ground on how that will come into the multilateral trading system. If this is done properly, it can make the WTO more inclusive, and it can be a natural building block for some of these newer issues. So even though it might be hard to find that consensus, I think it's worth the investment to do so, because then we have agreements that are long-standing. They can withstand the test of time. We're talking about geopolitics and the challenges we're facing today. 20 years ago, there were other challenges. Some are similar, some are different. So we have to have institutions that can withstand these challenges and the test of time. And going through that process of trying to find consensus as much as possible helps build the institution so that it can withstand these tests that we go through in time.
Thank you for that. There were several questions from the audience touching on the plurilateral solution and way forward, and several of the dispute settlement mechanism as well. But there's one, as we are approaching the hour. Do you have any concrete recommendations on how to make ministerial conference better serve to the WTO functioning? Are there anything you would encourage member states to do for preparing for the next conference? It's a tricky one.
For me, or is it for André?
I think it's for both of you. It doesn't say. It's a question from the audience, from Mr. Said Ahmed.
I think it's important to balance the work that we do in Geneva with the work we expect our ministers to undertake at a ministerial, because there is only so much that can be done within 5 days, right? You've been a minister, Cecilia. You've been to these ministerials. Yes.
To ministerials, yes.
How and discussing any one of these issues is incredibly complex. And so I think that it would be good to continue the work that's being done in Geneva and privilege trying to work as much as possible so that ministers can not only come to important decisions during ministerials, but also do the other aspects of a ministerial that are important, that have to do with deliberations, with engagement, looking at new issues, and coming to some common understandings.
Do you have anything to add on this, André?
I don't really. I don't. I would more wish to hear from you, Cecilia, on this, because I have not participated to a ministerial conference, and you indeed have been the trade commissioner. So I mean, I see ministers meet, many for many things, not just trade ministers, and I think it's the life of those things that you cannot expect ministers to deal with more than a limited number of issues, right? So personally, if I would, I don't know how the preparation goes, but there needs to be 3 issues at the maximum, it seems to me, that can be left for the meeting when the ministers come about to deal with. More, I think, is completely unreasonable. So I don't know at all how the preparation of those meetings go, how many items I really put on the table that demand the decision on the part of the ministers. But personally, I would say 3 is the maximum that is reasonable. But please tell me how it works in reality.
Well, one very concrete advice that we're always bringing home from these ministerials is, of course, that the capitals need to be much more involved in what happens in Geneva, that the ambassadors who do a fantastic job, many of them, they lack the support from their capitals, from their governments, from their ministers, and that when the trade ministers come, they don't really have a full mandate because the rest of the government is not really engaged in the same way. So that would be something. Johanna, I have a quick question for you. Is the longer 36-page draft on dispute resolution that was apparently produced at the MC13 available to the public, or is it an internal document?
I would not be able to say, Cecilia.
Okay.
I haven't seen
Okay, maybe you can look that up, and Mr. Marcus Stanley will come back to you. There's a direct question to you as well on geopolitics. Mr. Sapir, don't you think that in the present geopolitical situation you well described, a solution to the big problems that require consensus are not feasible?
No, I don't. I'm not of that. I'm not despairing at all. I think that it can be found. Again, countries are members of the WTO for a purpose, right? So I think countries do believe that trade is useful for their economic and even their political situation. So I do see that, and that's why I'm not one to to look negatively at the results of MC13 or the WTO in general over the years. I think countries continue to value the WTO. So I don't think that geopolitics is preventing the WTO from functioning. But I think the WTO, as it is, has some number of problems. And we spoke about the appellate body as being one of them, and national security. So I think one has to be, I mean, it's hard to do within the WTO. Those matters are not discussed, right? It's very hard. I mean, when we wrote, you remember, Cecilia, we wrote this book with Petros Mavroidis on China and the WTO. We made presentation at the WTO secretary. Those kind of issues are not discussed very easily by ambassadors in Geneva. Those, really sticking points. Those are matters of the capitals. And it's true of national security and the link to the appellate body, but I don't think that countries do not understand the importance of those matters. We need to find a way to bring them and to be truthful about where our difficulty. I think it's not because we value the system that we agree on everything on geopolitics, and there is a area that needs to be clearly defined, and where we need to say, okay, there we disagree. And we disagree on certain areas. We cannot agree possibly. And what implication does it have for the way we manage the WTO? Does it mean that we need to change certain rules? Does it mean that we need to change certain behavior? I think this is, but not to discuss them because it's too confrontational. I don't think it's helpful. So, but I think the big countries, and the three biggest traders, the EU, US, and China, I think they understand that. They talk about it, actually. And I think that's why I'm not so despaired about the matter.
Johanna, your final words. Do you share that slight optimism?
Yes, I think that the organization is a great forum to foster dialogue, to foster cooperation. As I said, it's a great source of information for member states through the different notifications, the participation that countries do at the different committees and councils. So I do think that in times of where we see a bigger role of geopolitics and uncertainty, this is when the organization is even more important, I think, to aid and to help countries navigate through difficult waters.
Thank you for this, Johanna Hill, André Sapir. It's been a pleasure discussing with you. There are huge challenges, but there's also a hope and processes ongoing, and that's the only way forward that we're aware of. So thank you for joining. Thank you to all of you who joined us today, and have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are.
Very good. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
It was nice, very nice discussion.
Yeah, hope to see you soon.
Hope to see you soon too. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.